The last thing Marcus said before my phone lit up was, "She calls herself a consultant. I call it a hobby." He was laughing when he said it. 6 people at that table, good china, candles burned down to 2 inches. And not one of them looked at me when he said it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not what he said. Who didn't look up? My phone was face down on the white linen napkin to my right. It buzzed once. Then again, the double pulse that means a call. I put my hand on my wine glass instead. Didn't touch the phone, just let it ring. I already knew it was going to change everything. But I wanted to finish my wine first. Before we go any further, what time is it? Where you are right now, drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's sitting at this table with me tonight. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the west side of Atlanta where the kitchen window faced a brick wall, and my mother kept a jar of emergency cash taped to the back of the radiator because banks, she said, could close on you overnight, but a radiator never would. She was a practical woman, not bitter, just accurate. She worked the front desk at a dental office for 22 years, and she never once complained about the job, only about the commute, only about the 6:14 bus that ran late every Thursday without explanation or apology. She kept a ledger, an actual paper ledger, spiral-bound blue cover, where she tracked every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out. Groceries, electric bill, my school supplies, the $12 she put aside every month toward nothing in particular, which she called the Quiet Fund. I asked her once what the Quiet Fund was for. She said, "For when the noise gets too loud." I did not understand that until I was 34 years old. I started my first company at 26 in the 2nd bedroom of an apartment smaller than the one I grew up in, which I did not think was possible until I was signing the lease. I had $4,200 in a checking account, a laptop with a cracked hinge I kept closed with a binder clip, and a client list of 3, a small accounting firm in Buckhead, a pediatric dentist in Decatur, and a woman named Gloria, who ran a hair salon out of her garage and needed someone to manage her books and her vendors and her suppliers, and occasionally her cousin Raymond, who kept ordering product she hadn't approved. I charged them each $800 a month. I did not tell anyone what I was doing, not because I was ashamed, because I had watched enough women in my neighborhood announce things before they were finished, and spend the next 3 years explaining why it hadn't worked out yet. I had a thing about finishing before talking. My mother called it secretive. I called it efficient. By the time I met Marcus, I had 17 clients and a 2nd bedroom I no longer slept in because it had become an office with a proper door and a lock I used. We met at a fundraiser for a literacy nonprofit in Midtown, the kind of event where everyone is dressed well and nobody talks about money directly, but money is present in every conversation like a third guest no one introduces. Marcus was in commercial real estate. He had a firm handshake and a good suit, and he asked me questions and then actually listened to the answers, which at 31 felt rare enough to be remarkable. He laughed at the right moments. He remembered 3 weeks later on our 2nd date that I took my coffee with 1 sugar and no cream, which is a small thing that felt large at the time. We were married 14 months after we met. I remember standing in the bridal suite at Cascade Hills with my mother zipping the back of my dress and thinking I should tell him the full number, the real number, the actual size of what I had been building quietly in that 2nd bedroom, and then in a proper office in Sandy Springs, and then in a portfolio that had begun to look less like a small business and more like something else entirely. I didn't tell him, not because I was hiding it, because I had learned by then that money changes the temperature of a room. I had watched it happen to other women. The moment a man understands the full scope of what you have, something shifts. Sometimes toward respect, more often toward entitlement, toward a casual assumption of access, toward the slow renegotiation of who owes what to whom. I told myself I would tell him after the wedding. Then after the first year, then after we had settled into something that felt permanent enough to hold the weight of the truth. By year 3, I had stopped setting a deadline. It was not a lie. It was an architecture. Everything was structured correctly. The LLC, the holding company, the investment accounts. All of it registered under names that were legally mine, but not immediately traceable to the woman who made his coffee on Sunday mornings and sat beside him in the 4th pew at Cascade Hills Baptist every week. My accountant knew. My attorney knew. My mother knew, because you cannot hide a ledger from a woman who taught you how to keep one. Marcus knew I worked. He knew I had clients. He knew I went to the office 3 days a week and took calls on the other 2, and occasionally flew to New York or Chicago for meetings I described as routine. What he did not know was the number. What he did not know was that the quiet fund had grown. I think about the version of myself that morning, the morning of the dinner party, standing in our kitchen at 7 a.m., ironing the linen napkins on the kitchen counter. Because we didn't own an ironing board, just a folded towel we'd laid flat on the granite. I was ironing napkins for a dinner where my husband would 4 hours later tell our pastor that my career was a hobby. I did not know that yet. I was just ironing. The light in the kitchen was the pale, flat gray of early Atlanta autumn, and the coffee maker was finishing its cycle, and outside the window, the neighbor's dog was doing its slow lap around the yard, and everything felt like a regular Saturday. That's the thing about the last ordinary morning. It always feels ordinary until it doesn't. The first sign was a text message I was never supposed to see. Not because Marcus hid his phone. He didn't. Not then, not yet. He left it on the kitchen counter the way he always did. Screen-up notifications visible, the casual confidence of a man who had never been checked. I was walking past on my way to refill my coffee. The screen lit up on its own. A name I didn't recognize. A preview line that stopped me mid-step. Did you find out how much she actually makes? I stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4. The coffee mug was warm in my hand. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car backed out of a driveway on our street. Slowly, the reverse lights bleeding white across the kitchen window for a moment, and then gone. I kept walking. That was a Thursday in late September. I remember because I had a call with my attorney in Chicago that afternoon about a portfolio acquisition we had been structuring for 11 months. And I remember being distracted on the call, in a way I almost never was. And my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had known me for 9 years and had no patience for distraction, said, "Stella, where are you right now?" And I said, "I'm here." And she said, "You are not." I did not tell her why. I went back to the kitchen counter that evening after Marcus had gone to shower. Picked up his phone. The screen was locked. I set it back down. I was not the kind of woman who went through her husband's phone, not because I was naive, but because I'd always believed that if you needed to look, you already had your answer. The looking was just the paperwork. But something had shifted in the temperature of the house, and I couldn't locate it precisely. It was in small things. The way Marcus had started prefacing stories about me to other people with, "My wife, bless her heart." That particular Southern construction that sounds like affection and functions like dismissal. The way he had begun answering questions about our finances at dinner parties with a certainty that did not match anything he actually knew. "We do all right," he would say, swirling his glass. "Nothing crazy." And people would nod and move on, and I would sit beside him and say nothing, because correcting your husband in front of company felt like a different kind of problem. I noticed it in the way he talked to Robert, his oldest friend, on Sunday afternoons on our back porch. I would hear fragments through the kitchen window while I was cooking, something about investment potential, something about assets, something about her side of things not amounting to much. I told myself I was mishearing. I told myself the window distorted things. I told myself a lot of things that autumn that I have since stopped telling myself. The second sign was the question he asked me in October. We were in the car coming back from his firm's fall mixer, and he was driving, and I was in the passenger seat with my heels off and my feet on the dashboard, the way I always rode when it was just the two of us, and late enough that the roads were mostly empty. He asked it casually, the way you ask about something you've been sitting with for a while, and have finally decided to surface. If something happened to you, he said, eyes on the road, what would happen to your accounts, like the business stuff? Would it just dissolve? I looked at him. I mean, is there anything there to even worry about? He adjusted his grip on the wheel. I'm just asking from a planning perspective. Estate stuff. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I have an attorney. Everything is structured. Right, but structured how? Like, what are we actually talking about in terms of numbers? I turned to look out the window. The highway lights were passing overhead in long orange intervals, one after another, rhythmic and cold. Enough, I said. He laughed. The kind of laugh that means the answer didn't satisfy him, but he had decided not to push further. Not yet. Enough, he repeated like it was a punchline. Okay, Stella. I did not say anything else for the rest of the drive, but I noticed that he didn't ask again. And the not asking told me more than the asking had. A man who genuinely wanted to plan for your future asks follow-up questions. A man who got the answer he was looking for goes quiet and thinks. Marcus went quiet and thought for the rest of October. I kept working. Took a call from the Forbes editor the first week of November. David Okafor, a man I had spoken to twice before, about a potential feature, always deferring, always not yet, always let me think about the timing. That call I cut short because Marcus was home early, and I had not yet decided how I wanted that particular door to open. I told David I'd call him back in 2 weeks. I called my mother that night instead. She was watching her evening news. I could hear the television in the background, and I told her what was happening in pieces, the text message, the car conversation, the particular quality of Marcus's silences. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, where's your ledger?" I knew what she meant. She didn't mean paper. She meant, what do you actually have, and where is it, and can anyone take it? I spent the next 3 days making calls. Patricia in Chicago, my accountant, a family attorney in Atlanta I had never needed before. I did not tell any of them the full picture yet, just asked questions, mapped the terrain, understood where I stood. By the end of that week, I understood exactly where I stood. What I did not yet understand was how much Marcus had already said to how many people, and how deliberately, and with what intention. That part came later. And it came from a direction I hadn't expected. It came from Amber. I found out about Amber on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, and I found out the way you find out, about most things that have been hiding in plain sight, not through dramatic revelation, but through a small administrative accident that nobody planned for. I was looking for a parking validation receipt. Marcus had taken my car the previous Friday because his was in the shop, a routine thing, brake pads 2 days maximum. And when he returned it Sunday evening, I noticed he'd moved the passenger seat forward, which he never did, because he was 6 inches taller than me and had no reason to. I didn't say anything, filed it, moved on. Tuesday morning, I was leaving for a meeting in Buckhead and needed the validation receipt from a parking deck I'd used 2 weeks prior for an expense report my accountant had requested. I checked the glove compartment. Not there. Checked the center console. Found 3 things: a gas station receipt from a station 14 miles from our house, in a neighborhood Marcus had no reason to visit, a folded piece of paper with a handwritten address I didn't recognize on Peyton Road, and a phone. Not Marcus's regular phone. A second phone, prepaid. The kind with the plastic back and the smaller screen, the kind that costs $43 at a drugstore and is paid for in cash and exists for exactly one purpose. I sat in the driver's seat of my own car in our own garage for a long moment. The garage door was still closed. The overhead light was on its 2-minute timer, and I watched it click off and sat in the dark and held the phone in both hands, the way you hold something that has just changed the shape of what you thought you knew. I turned it on. It took a moment to power up. The wallpaper was a default gray. No passcode either. He hadn't set one, or he had forgotten to the kind of careless detail that tells you a man believes he will never be found out. There was one contact saved under a first name only, Amber. 41 text messages. I did not read all of them. I read enough. The earliest ones were what you would expect: the architecture of an affair, the logistics, the particular vocabulary of two people who believe they are the only ones who know. I moved past those. I was looking for something specific without knowing yet what it was, the way you sometimes search a document, not for a particular word, but for the sentence that makes the other sentences make sense. I found it in a message from 3 weeks prior. Marcus had sent it at 11:47 p.m. on a night I remembered because I had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for him to come home from what he told me was a client dinner. Talked to my guy at the courthouse. She has nothing in her name. I checked. The business is basically a pass-through. There's no real asset base. When we move, there's nothing to fight over. I read it twice. Then I scrolled up 2 messages to Amber's response. So, we're good. Like actually good. And, Marcus, we're good. Just let me handle the timing. I want to do it right. I sat with that for a long time. The garage was cold. The overhead light had long since gone off, and I hadn't moved to trigger the sensor again, so I was sitting in the dark, in my own car, reading my husband's exit strategy on a phone he had hidden in the center console of a vehicle he had borrowed for 4 days, thinking I would never look. She has nothing in her name. I turned the phone over in my hands. I thought about the LLC, the holding company, the investment portfolio that Patricia had spent the better part of a decade helping me structure with the specific intention that it not be immediately visible to anyone who ran a casual courthouse search. I thought about my mother's radiator jar. I thought about the spiral-bound ledger with the blue cover. I thought about the $12 a month set aside for when the noise got too loud. The noise, it turned out, had been building for a while. I just hadn't been listening for it from this direction. I put the second phone exactly where I had found it, repositioned the gas station receipt on top of it, closed the center console, adjusted the passenger seat back to where Marcus had left it. Then I opened the garage, backed out, and drove to my meeting in Buckhead, where I sat across a conference table from 3 men in good suits and closed a deal on a commercial property acquisition worth $2.3 million, without anyone in the room knowing that 40 minutes earlier I had been sitting in the dark reading my own obituary. I ordered the salmon. I took notes in my good notebook. I shook hands at the end and smiled the way I had learned to smile, in rooms where smiling was a tool and not an emotion. In the car afterward, I called Patricia. I did not tell her everything. I told her I needed to understand the full picture of my exposure in the event of a divorce, filing what was visible, what was protected, what could be contested, and what could not. Patricia was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she got quiet when she was thinking fast. "Are we talking hypothetically?" she asked. "We're talking carefully," I said. She understood. That was the thing about Patricia. She never needed the full sentence. "I'll have something for you by Friday," she said. "Don't move anything yet. Don't change anything. Just let everything sit exactly where it is." I said I understood. "Stella." Her voice had a different register now, lower the one she used when she stopped being an attorney for a moment. "Are you okay?" I watched the Atlanta traffic move in front of me on Peyton Road, the same street name written on that folded piece of paper in my center console, I realized. I looked at the buildings going past. A dry cleaner, a nail salon, a church with a marquee sign that read, "The truth doesn't need your permission to arrive." "I will be," I said. And I meant it, not as comfort, as a plan. Patricia sent the documents on Friday at 4:47 p.m., 12 minutes before her office closed for the weekend, which meant she had worked on them all week and held them until the last responsible moment, her way of telling me the situation was serious. Without saying so directly, I read them at the kitchen table while Marcus was in the shower. 41 pages. I had read longer contracts over breakfast without looking up. But these were different because they had my name in them in a different way, not as a party to a transaction, but as a person being assessed for vulnerability. Patricia had mapped everything. What was protected under the LLC structure. What a divorce attorney could argue was marital property depending on how the filing was framed. What was airtight? What had a seam? There was one seam. A joint account Marcus and I had opened in year 2 of our marriage for household expenses, utilities, groceries, the mortgage on the house. I had never thought of it as significant because it was never significant. We each deposited a fixed amount, monthly paid the bills, and what remained was negligible. But a competent divorce attorney, Patricia noted in her clean, precise language, could use that account as an argument for commingling a thread thin but real that, if pulled correctly, could create an argument for broader access to assets. Recommend closing or restructuring before any filing is initiated, she had written. Do not initiate. Simply restructure as part of routine financial planning. Timing is important. I closed the document, poured myself a glass of water, stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the backyard where the oak tree we had planted in year 1 was now tall enough to shade the entire left side of the yard. Marcus came downstairs in his robe. Asked what I was reading. I said, "Work stuff." He nodded and opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a long time, looking at things without taking anything the way he did when he was thinking about something else entirely. Then he took a beer and went to the living room and turned on the game. I washed my glass, dried it, put it away. That was the first night of what I came to think of as the quiet period, the 2 weeks between finding the phone and the dinner party. 14 days of knowing exactly what I knew and choosing deliberately to let the surface of things remain undisturbed. No confrontation, no change in routine, no signal that anything had shifted. I have read since then about how intelligence agencies call this the collection phase, the period before action, where the goal is simply to gather without alerting. I did not think of it in those terms at the time. I thought of it the way my mother would have: don't tip the jar before you know what's in it. I went to work, took my calls, flew to Chicago on Wednesday for 2 days of meetings with Patricia and my accountant. Well, it's a man named Gerald, who had been managing my books since year 3 and who received the news about the joint account with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this category of problem to arrive. "How long do we have?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "He said he was waiting for the right timing." Gerald nodded slowly. "Then we move on our timing." He pulled up the account structures on his screen. "I can have the restructuring completed by end of next week. It'll look like routine planning because it is routine planning. Nothing unusual. Nothing that reads as reactive." I told him to proceed. I flew back to Atlanta on Thursday evening. Marcus picked me up from the airport, which he rarely did, and I noticed he was in a good mood, the particular elevated mood of a man who believes things are going according to plan. He asked about Chicago. I said it was productive. He asked if I was hungry. I said a little. He suggested the Thai place on Ponce, and I said that sounded good. And we sat across from each other in a restaurant booth and talked about nothing consequential for an hour and a half. And he paid the check and held the door open for me on the way out. And I thought, he has no idea. not as cruelty, as information. The dinner party had been on the calendar for 3 weeks, a recurring thing, 6 friends, rotating houses, nothing formal. When it landed on our house this time, I had considered canceling. Then I reconsidered. Then I did something I had not planned to do when I first put the date in the calendar. I revised the guest list. The original list had 8 names. I removed 2 a couple Marcus had added who I didn't know well and had no particular need to have present. I added 2 others. Pastor Reeves, who Marcus had told 2 months ago that Stella doesn't really work in the traditional sense, and Diane Holloway, who sat on the board of 2 Atlanta nonprofits and had heard Marcus describe my career at a charity gala as a little side thing she does to stay busy. I sent the revised invitations. Nobody questioned the change. I spent the Saturday morning of the dinner party the way I spent most Saturday mornings, coffee the news, a call with my mother at 9. I told her about the dinner. She was quiet for a moment. "Who's coming?" she asked. I told her. Another silence. Then, "You ironing the good napkins?" "Already done," I said. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "All right then." A pause. "You call me after." "I will." "And Stella?" Her voice settled into the registers she used when she wanted me to hear something without the weight of instruction. "You don't have to do anything tonight. You don't have to say a word. Sometimes you just have to be in the room when the room figures it out." I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon while I arranged the centerpiece and set the table and folded the ironed napkins into the shape my mother had taught me when I was 9 years old. A simple fold, nothing fancy, the kind that said someone took care with this. At 5:30, I put on a dark green wrap dress and low heels and a single gold bracelet my mother had given me the year I closed my first 7-figure deal. No other jewelry. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, not checking, just looking. And then I went downstairs and finished the preparations and opened a bottle of wine to breathe and waited for the doorbell to ring. At 6:14, the first guests arrived. Marcus greeted them at the door with his jacket already on. The dinner started the way these dinners always started, slowly, pleasantly, with the particular warmth of people who have known each other long enough to skip the formal layer and go straight to the comfortable one. Pastor Reeves and his wife Gloria arrived first at 6:14, him in a charcoal blazer and her in a burgundy wrap that she complimented my dress against when she hugged me in the doorway. Robert and his wife Keisha came 7 minutes later with a bottle of Bordeaux and an apology about traffic on I-285 that nobody required, but everyone accepted graciously. Diane Holloway arrived alone. Her husband was traveling in a cream blazer with reading glasses pushed up on her head the way she always wore them, like a woman who had stopped pretending she didn't need them. And then Amber. I want to be precise about this, because the precision matters. I had known for 11 days that Amber existed. I had known her name, had seen it on a prepaid phone in my center console, had read 41 text messages that told me the shape and the intention of what she was to my husband. What I had not known, what I discovered when Marcus opened the front door at 6:41 and stepped back to let her in, was that he had invited her to my table. She was 29, and she was pretty, in the way the character Bible described the long chestnut hair, the wide-set eyes, the smile that worked better in photographs. She was wearing a burnt orange wrap dress and low heels that were almost identical to mine, which I registered and set aside. She came in with a bottle of wine and a smile directed first at Marcus, and then a half-second later corrected toward me. "You must be Stella," she said. "Marcus talks about you all the time." "Does he?" I said. Not a question. I took the wine. "I'll open this later. Come in." I watched Marcus's jaw just for a moment, just a flicker, before he turned to take her coat. I went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for exactly 45 seconds. Breathed. placed the bottle of wine she had brought in the far corner of the counter where it would not be opened. Then I picked up the serving dish I had been about to bring out and carried it to the table and said, "Dinner's almost ready. Everyone find a seat." I had arranged the seating that afternoon. Marcus at the head, me to his left. Pastor Reeves directly across from Marcus at the other end. Diane beside Pastor Reeves, where she could hear everything said at both ends of the table. Amber between Robert and Keisha, which put her in the middle of the table, visible to everyone adjacent to no one with authority. We ate. The food was good. I had made my mother's braised short ribs with roasted sweet potatoes and a green bean salad with toasted almonds. And the conversation moved the way conversation moves at good dinners, topic to topic, without agenda laughter arriving naturally and departing the same way. Marcus was in excellent spirits. That was the word for it. Spirits plural elevated the mood of a man who believed the evening was proceeding according to an architecture only he could see. He poured wine generously. He told the story about the Falcons game 2 weeks ago that he had already told Robert twice, but told again because it landed well. And he liked the way it landed. He was charming in the way he could be charming, when he felt secure, attentive, funny, the version of himself that had made me say yes 14 months after we met. I watched him, and I ate my short ribs, and I thought he invited her to my table. The first comment came 40 minutes into dinner, organic as weather. Robert had asked Diane about a commercial development project in West Midtown that her nonprofit was involved in, and Diane had explained it with the clarity of a woman who understood both the financial and the community dimensions of what she was describing. And Marcus had nodded along, with the expression of a man absorbing information he considered beneath him. And then Robert turned to me and said, "Stella, doesn't your work touch on some of that, the commercial side?" Before I could answer, Marcus laughed. "Stella's more in the advisory space," he said with a gesture of his hand that managed to suggest something small and indefinite. "Consulting, you know how it is." Robert looked at me. I smiled at Robert. "Something like that," I said. Marcus took a sip of wine. "She keeps busy," he said to the table generally with the tone of a man describing a beloved but non-committal hobby. "I keep telling her she should think bigger, but you know, some people are comfortable where they are." Diane looked at me over her reading glasses. I held her gaze for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at my plate. "Must be nice," Amber said from the middle of the table pleasantly, "to not have to worry about the big stuff." Keisha's fork paused above her plate. "Just for a moment." I cut a piece of short rib. "It has its advantages," I said. Marcus smiled the smile of a man who believed he was winning something. He refilled his own glass. He leaned back in his chair, the jacket still on. Always the jacket. And the candlelight caught the face of his watch. And I thought about that watch, the one he'd bought 2 years ago on a trip to New York, the one that had cost more than 3 months of what he told people he earned. The second comment came 20 minutes later, unprompted. Pastor Reeves had made a gentle observation about financial planning, something he'd heard at a conference, something about generational wealth and intentionality. And Marcus had taken the opening the way he took most openings, with both hands. "That's the thing," Marcus said. "You've got to have real assets, real tangible things. Not just," he paused, the pause of a man choosing a word that he had already chosen, "not just ideas. You know what I mean, Pastor. At the end of the day, what do you actually have?" Pastor Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "Marcus is very traditional about these things," I said pleasantly. "I just believe in substance," Marcus said. He glanced at me quickly, a dart of a glance, then back to Pastor Reeves. "Some of us have it. Some of us are still figuring out what we bring to the table." The table went quiet for just a moment. The kind of quiet that happens when something has been said that is slightly too pointed to be ignored and slightly too vague to be called out directly. Diane set her fork down. Robert took a long sip of water. Keisha looked at her plate. Amber smiled. And then my phone face down on the white linen napkin to my right, exactly where I had placed it before anyone arrived, buzzed once. Then again. The double pulse of a call. Marcus looked at it, then at me. You going to get that? In a moment, I said. I lifted my wine glass, took a slow sip, set it back down without a sound. The phone buzzed a third time. I placed 2 fingers on its back, turned it over. White background, black text, a New York area code I recognized. And below it, in clean sans serif letters that the candlelight made perfectly legible to anyone seated within 4 feet of my place, setting Forbes magazine, David Okafor, senior editor. I looked at it for exactly the length of time it took Marcus to register what he was reading. Then I looked up at him. His expression was not what I expected. It wasn't confusion. It was the specific face of a man who has just heard a sound he cannot immediately explain, alert, recalibrating, not yet certain what he's dealing with, but certain suddenly that something is different than he thought. "Excuse me," I said. "One moment." I pushed back my chair, folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, picked up my phone and walked not quickly, not slowly through the dining room, and down the hall to the back of the house, where the small sitting room was. Closed the door behind me and answered on what would have been the last ring. "David," I said. "Stella." His voice was warm, professional, the voice of a man who had been trying to have this conversation for 3 months. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." I looked at the closed door. On the other side of it, 6 people were sitting at my dining room table, in the particular silence of people waiting to understand what had just happened. "Not at all," I said. "Tell me about the cover." David Okafor had been a senior editor at Forbes for 11 years, and he had the voice of a man who understood that the people he called were busy and important and had learned to say what he needed to say without wasting the architecture of a sentence. He said, "We want to do the feature right. Full profile, November issue. That's our wealth issue, as you know. We're looking at a cover option depending on how the photography session goes. But I want to be honest with you, Stella. The editorial team is enthusiastic. This isn't a maybe. We're building the issue around 3 profiles, and yours is the anchor." I was standing in the small sitting room at the back of our house, the room we had furnished together in year 2. A love seat in a dark blue fabric, 2 low bookshelves, a lamp with a warm amber shade that I had found at an estate sale in Decatur, and that Marcus had called ugly until guests started complimenting it. I was standing in front of that lamp, and I could hear faintly the sound of people at the table. Not words, just the texture of conversation resuming careful and quiet, the way conversation resumes when someone has left the room and taken the subject with them. "What's the framing?" I asked. "Quiet capital," David said. "Women building significant wealth structures below the visibility threshold, not because they're hiding, but because they're building. You're the clearest example we've found of the model done right. The LLC architecture, the portfolio diversification, the community investment arm, our research team spent 3 weeks on the public filings alone, and they said it reads like a masterclass." I sat down on the edge of the love seat. "The number we're working with," David continued, "is the $47 million net asset figure from the Q3 filing. Is that still current, or has there been movement?" "There's been movement," I said. "Upward. I'll have Gerald send your research team the updated summary." "Perfect," I heard him making a note. "We'd want to shoot in Atlanta, your office, maybe a location that speaks to the community investment work. 2 days our photographer, full approval on final images before we go to print." "That works," I said. "One more thing." A brief pause. "The headline we're testing is The Invisible Architect. Our editors feel it captures the intentionality of the structure, the idea that the design of the thing is inseparable from the person who built it. Another pause. How do you feel about that? I looked at the lamp with the amber shade that Marcus had called ugly. I think it's accurate, I said. We spoke for 11 more minutes about logistics timeline, the photography brief, a fact-checking call with Gerald, scheduled for the following Tuesday. When we finished, David said, "I'm glad we finally got here, Stella. This has been a long time coming." "Yes," I said. "It has." I ended the call. Sat for a moment on the edge of the love seat in the amber light. Outside the sitting room door, the dinner party had not resumed its previous volume. I could hear it recalibrating voices lower than they had been, the particular register of a group of people who are trying to sound like they are not waiting. I stood, smoothed my dress, checked my reflection in the dark window, the green wrap, the single gold bracelet, the low, twisted bun with the loose coils at my temples. The small scar above my left brow, pale in the window glass. Then I opened the door and walked back down the hall. The dining room came into view incrementally as I approached first the edge of the table, then the centerpiece, then the faces. Robert with his hands folded on the table. Keisha sitting very straight. Diane with her reading glasses down on her nose now, which she only did when she was paying close attention. Pastor Reeves with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to be present in rooms where something important was happening. Amber with her wine glass raised halfway to her mouth, suspended there waiting. And Marcus. Sitting at the head of the table, with both hands flat on the white linen, his jacket still on, his expression arranged into something he intended to read as casual. And was reading instead as a man holding very still, because he did not yet know which direction the ground was moving. I pulled out my chair, sat down, unfolded my napkin and placed it back in my lap, lifted my fork. Then I looked up at the table and said in the same voice, "I used to close deals in conference rooms in Chicago and New York and Atlanta. They want to run the feature in the November issue, the wealth issue." Nobody spoke. "Cover option," I added. "Depending on the photography." Robert said, "Stella, what feature?" And so I told them, not everything. Not the second phone or the text messages or the courthouse search or Amber sitting 4 feet away in a burnt orange dress. Not the 14 days of the quiet period or the calls with Patricia or the restructuring Gerald had completed the previous Wednesday. Not my mother's radiator jar or the spiral-bound ledger or the $12 a month set aside for when the noise got too loud. Just the company, just the structure, just the numbers. I told them about the LLC I had registered 8 years ago under a name that was not my name. A holding company that had grown from 17 clients and $800 monthly retainers into a diversified portfolio that now encompassed commercial real estate, a private equity stake in 2 Atlanta-based tech startups, a community development fund that had dispersed $1.2 million to small businesses in underserved Atlanta neighborhoods over the past 3 years, and a net asset value that the Forbes research team had confirmed at $47 million in the Q3 filing, with movement upward since. I said the number the way my accountant Gerald had once told me, to say numbers plainly without apology or emphasis, the way you state a fact that does not require your permission to be true. $47 million. The dining room was very quiet. Diane had set her fork down. Pastor Reeves had leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he had understood. Robert was looking at his wine glass. Keisha was looking at me with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but something in the precise territory between the two. The face of a woman who had suspected something for a long time and had just been handed the confirmation. Marcus had not moved. His hands were still flat on the white linen. His jacket was still on. The watch face caught the candlelight the way it always did. I did not look at him directly. I spoke to the table, to all of them, the way you speak when the information belongs to everyone in the room equally. But I was aware of him in my peripheral vision, the way you are aware of a door that has just come off one of its hinges, still standing, but changed in a fundamental way that cannot be undone. The Forbes call was the editor confirming the timeline, I said. They've been asking for a few months. I kept deferring. The timing felt right tonight. Nobody asked why tonight. But I saw Diane look at Marcus. A brief look, clean and precise, the look of a woman who had just reorganized something in her understanding. Then she looked back at me and said, "Stella, that is extraordinary." "Thank you," I said. "The community fund." Pastor Reeves said, his voice returning first, steady and deliberate. "The $1.2 million, that's ongoing," I said. "Gerald manages the disbursement schedule. We have applications open for the next cycle through the end of December if you know of any businesses that qualify." Pastor Reeves nodded slowly. He looked at Marcus. It was not a long look, but it was a complete one. Marcus picked up his wine glass. His hand was steady, I will give him that. Whatever he was experiencing in that moment, he was managing it with the physical composure of a man who understood that the worst thing he could do right now was let the room see him come apart. He took a sip, set the glass down, and said in a voice that was almost what it had been an hour ago, "Why didn't you ever tell me the full picture?" The table went very still. I looked at him, directly for the first time since I had sat back down. I looked at the watch and the jacket, and the hands still flat on the white linen. I looked at the face of the man who had told our pastor that my career was a hobby and told Robert that I had nothing of substance, and typed on a prepaid phone at 11:47 p.m. "She has nothing in her name," I checked. "You never asked," I said, which was not entirely true. But it was true enough for this room on this night, with these particular people sitting at this table. Amber set her wine glass down. The small sound of it, glass on linen, barely audible, was the loudest thing in the room. The table held its silence for exactly the length of time. It takes a room to understand that something has permanently changed. Then Robert cleared his throat. Keisha reached for the water pitcher. Pastor Reeves placed both hands flat on the table in the deliberate way of a man grounding himself before he speaks. And Diane picked up her fork, cut a piece of short rib with the precision of a woman who had decided the best thing she could do right now was act normal, and said, "Stella, these ribs are extraordinary. Your mother's recipe." "Her mother's," I said. And just like that, the dinner resumed. Not the same dinner, it could not be the same dinner. The architecture of the evening had shifted in a way that everyone at the table understood, and no one was going to name directly, not tonight. But it resumed. Conversation moved. Wine was poured. The candles burned lower. Marcus did not speak for 11 minutes. I counted. Not obsessively, it was simply the kind of thing you notice when you are paying attention, and I had been paying attention to Marcus for 9 years. And I knew the texture of his silences, the way you know the sounds a house makes, which ones are structural and which ones are just weather. This silence was structural. This was the silence of a man whose internal scaffolding had just been quietly and comprehensively disassembled, and who was now sitting inside the wreckage trying to determine what, if anything, could be salvaged. When he finally spoke, it was to Robert. And it was about something else entirely, a property development in Cobb County, something he had mentioned before, the kind of conversational life raft a man reaches for when he needs to be seen talking about something he understands. Robert answered him. The conversation found its footing. Marcus laughed once at something Robert said, and the laugh was close to his real laugh, but not quite a quarter step flat, the way a note sounds when the instrument is slightly out of tune. Amber did not speak again after she set her wine glass down. I noticed this without looking at her directly. She was present in the middle of the table in her burnt orange dress, her long chestnut hair, her wide-set eyes that had spent the last 20 minutes performing a version of casual that was costing her significant effort. She ate her short ribs. She accepted a refill of water from Keisha with a small thank you. She laughed at the appropriate moments. I will give her that with the discipline of a woman who understood that the worst thing she could do right now was be the reason anyone looked at her. At 9:17, she stood. "I should head out," she said to the table. Generally, the way you address a group when you cannot address any individual in it. Early morning. Marcus stood too reflexively, the instinct of a man who has been performing courtesy all evening, and then sat back down when he understood what standing had implied. Diane watched this with the reading glasses on her nose and said nothing. I walked Amber to the door. This was my choice. I could have let her find her own coat and her own exit. But I walked her to the door because I wanted the last thing she saw in our house to be me standing in it, not angry, not triumphant, not performing anything. Just present. Just the woman whose house this was. At the door, she turned and looked at me, and for a moment her face did something unscripted. The smile dropped away. And what was underneath it was not malice, but something younger and less certain, the face of a woman who had made a calculation that had just been revealed to be based on wrong information. "It was nice to meet you," she said. "Drive safe," I said. I closed the door, stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then I went back to the table and sat down and picked up my wine glass. And Diane looked at me over her reading glasses with an expression that required no translation. And I gave her the smallest nod, barely a movement, just a degree of the chin, and she looked back at her plate. The dinner ended at 10:41. Pastor Reeves hugged me at the door with both arms, the full pastoral embrace he reserved for moments he considered significant. "You are remarkable," he said quietly into the space beside my ear. "I'm sorry for any—" he paused. "I am just sorry." "Don't be," I said. "You didn't know." He looked at me for a moment with the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where people were carrying things they hadn't named yet. "No," he said, "but I should have asked better questions." Robert shook my hand, actually shook it the way he shook hands in professional settings, and said, "Stella, I mean it. Call me next week." Which I understood was not a social call, but a professional one. Robert reassessing Robert, recalibrating Robert, understanding that he had been operating on incomplete information for years. Keisha hugged me and said nothing, which was exactly right. Diane was last. She put on her cream blazer and pushed her reading glasses up and stood in the doorway and said, "The community fund. I want to talk about a partnership. Seriously, my board has been looking for exactly that kind of structure." "Call me," I said. "I will call you Monday morning," she said. "Before 9. After they left, I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the empty street, the cars pulling away, the taillights going red at the corner, the neighborhood quiet and ordinary under the Atlanta night sky. Then I closed the door and turned around. Marcus was still at the table. He had not helped clear. He had not moved the glasses or folded the napkins or blown out the candles, all the small end-of-evening rituals that in 9 years of marriage we had always done together, one person on each side of the table, working toward the middle. He was sitting in his chair with his jacket still on and his hands wrapped around a wine glass that had been empty for a while, and he was looking at the centerpiece, the flowers I'd arranged that afternoon from the garden we both pretended to share. I began clearing the table. I carried the plates to the kitchen, stacked them in the sink, covered the leftover short ribs, put the salad bowl in the refrigerator. I worked quietly and methodically, the way my mother had taught me, everything in its place. Surfaces clean, nothing left unfinished overnight, because tomorrow had enough of its own requirements without inheriting today's disorder. Marcus watched me from the table. When I came back for the glasses, he said, "How long?" I picked up 2 glasses. "How long what?" "How long has it been that size?" I thought about the question, about the honest answer to it, which was longer than our marriage, longer than the fundraiser in Midtown, where he'd asked me questions and listened to the answers, longer than most of the things we had built together, which turned out to have been built on land I'd already surveyed and owned. "A while," I said. He was quiet. Then, "You didn't trust me." I set the glasses down on the table and looked at him, at the watch, the jacket, the hands that had typed. "She has nothing in her name. I checked at 11:47 p.m. while I was asleep on the couch." "Marcus," I said, "did you trust me?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the centerpiece again. I picked up the glasses and carried them to the kitchen. Came back for the candlesticks, blew them out one by one. 6 small extinctions, each one, leaving a thin curl of smoke rising toward the ceiling of the dining room where we had sat tonight, with 6 people, and a phone call, and the weight of everything neither of us had said for 9 years. When the last candle was out, I picked up my phone from where I had left it on the sideboard, face down, where I always left it, and I walked upstairs. I did not say goodnight. Some endings don't require a final line. They just require you to leave the room. Marcus slept in the guest room that night. I knew because I heard the door close at 11:43, a careful close, the kind that is trying not to be heard, which is the loudest kind. I was lying in our bed in the dark with my eyes open and the Atlanta night outside the window, doing what Atlanta nights do in November, which is settle into a cold that is not dramatic but is final, the kind of cold that means summer is not coming back for a while. I did not sleep well. I did not expect to. At 6:14 I got up, made coffee, called my mother. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake already, which meant she had been waiting, which meant she was my mother. "Tell me," she said. I told her. All of it, the Forbes call the table. Amber standing up and leaving Marcus's hands flat on the white linen, the candles going out one by one. My mother listened without interrupting, which she could do for longer than anyone I'd ever known. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" Not how did it go, not what happens next. How do you feel? "Tired," I said. "And clear." "That's the right order," she said. Marcus came downstairs at 8. I was on my second cup of coffee at the kitchen table with my laptop open, answering emails, a normal Sunday morning in the architecture of our life together, except that nothing about it was normal anymore. And we both understood this, and neither of us had yet spoken the word that would make it official. He poured himself coffee, stood at the counter, did not sit. "I want to understand," he said to his coffee cup, "how we got here." I looked up from my laptop. "Which part?" He turned. His face in the morning light was different than it had been at the dinner table. The performance had come down. The jacket was gone. He was in a gray sweatshirt and bare feet, and he looked for the first time in a long time like a man rather than a presentation of one. "All of it," he said. "Why you never told me. Why you built all of that and kept me outside of it." I closed my laptop. I thought about the honest answer. The real one, not the clean one. The one that started not with a text message on a prepaid phone, but years before that, in the small incremental moments where I'd offered information and watched what he did with it, where I had tested the temperature of the room and found it running cold, where I had learned not once but repeatedly in the accumulation of small lessons that become a single understanding that Marcus related to wealth the way some men relate to territory, not with curiosity, with assessment. "I tried," I said, "early on. You remember the conversation about the LLC year 2? He frowned. "Vaguely. You told me it sounded complicated and asked if I needed help simplifying the structure." I paused. "You meant it kindly, But what I heard was, let me have access to this, and I wasn't ready for that. So, you just decided to keep it from me. For 9 years. I decided to protect what I built, I said. There's a difference. He set his coffee cup down on the counter with slightly more force than necessary, not a slam. Just an emphasis, the physical punctuation of a man who was losing an argument he didn't know he was in. You didn't trust me enough to tell me what you had. I looked at him. Marcus? What? Where is your second phone? The kitchen went very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the neighbor's dog began its slow lap around the yard, the same circuit it made every morning, oblivious and content. Marcus's face did the thing I had been waiting for it to do since the dinner table, the thing underneath the composure, the real thing, the one that confirmed what I already knew and had been carrying alone for 14 days. He said nothing. I found it 3 weeks ago, I said. Center console, you'd moved the passenger seat forward. He looked at the counter, at his coffee cup, at the window, at all the places in the kitchen that were not my face. I read enough, I said. I know about Amber. I know about the courthouse search. I know what you told her. She has nothing in her name. I checked. I know you were waiting for the right timing. The word timing landed the way I intended it to, as a mirror, as the thing he had said on that phone returned to the room where it had been planned. Marcus sat down. Not at the table at the kitchen island, on the stool closest to the counter, like a man who needed something solid behind him. He put both hands on the granite and looked at them. It wasn't, he started. Don't, I said. Not harshly, just clearly. Don't tell me what it was or wasn't. I have the messages. He closed his mouth. I picked up my coffee cup. I've already spoken to Patricia. The filing will happen on her timeline, not yours. The joint account has been restructured. Gerald handled it 2 weeks ago, routine financial planning, nothing that can be contested as reactive. I paused. The LLC and the holding company are fully protected. Your attorney is going to tell you the same thing mine already told me. He looked up at me. His eyes were doing something I hadn't seen in a long time, something unguarded. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding what he had lost. Not the money, not the access, but the actual thing. The woman at the kitchen table, with the coffee and the laptop. And the gold bracelet from the year she closed her first 7-figure deal. Stella, I'm not angry, I said. And I meant it. Anger had come and gone. In the 14 days of the quiet period had arrived in the garage, in the dark, holding a prepaid phone, and had burned through cleanly the way a fever breaks. What remained was not anger. What remained was clarity. I'm just done. He was quiet for a long time. Then, the Forbes cover. Yes. That was, you did that on purpose, tonight. I considered the question. The honest answer was yes and no. I had not manufactured the call, could not have manufactured it. David Okafor had been trying to reach me for 3 months, and the timing had been his, not mine. But I had chosen not to reschedule. I had looked at the dinner party and the guest list, and the man who was planning to tell the world his wife had nothing. And I had decided to let the call come when it came. I let it happen, I said. There's a difference. Marcus looked at his hands on the granite. Pastor Reeves, he said. Robert, Diane. Yes, I said. You invited them specifically. I revised the guest list, I said. Yes. He absorbed this. The morning light moved through the kitchen window and crossed the floor between us, pale and flat and neutral, illuminating nothing in particular. Was any of it real? He asked. The question was quiet. Stripped of performance, stripped of strategy, the question of a man at the bottom of something looking up. The marriage. Was any of it? I thought about the fundraiser in Midtown. the questions he'd asked and actually listened to. The coffee order remembered 3 weeks later. The oak tree we'd planted in year 1 that was now tall enough to shade the entire left side of the yard. "Yes," I said. "For a while?" He nodded slowly. Like a man accepting a verdict he had known was coming, but had hoped might be different. I opened my laptop, pulled up my email. The first message at the top was from Diane Holloway, sent at 7:53 that morning, 41 minutes ago, before most people were awake on a Sunday, with the subject line, "Partnership Discussion." This week. The second was from David Okafor confirming the photography brief. The third was from Robert, just 3 words, "Call me Monday." I read all 3 without responding. Then I closed my laptop again and looked at the kitchen, the counters I had cleaned the night before the coffee maker finishing its cycle the window with the neighbor's yard beyond it and the oak tree at the edge of the frame. Bare now in November, the leaves all down the branches clean against the gray Atlanta sky. "I'll stay in the guest room," Marcus said, "till we figure out the logistics." "That's fine," I said. He stood, picked up his coffee, paused at the edge of the kitchen. "The Invisible Architect," he said. The Forbes headline I had mentioned to the table the night before. He said it the way you say a phrase you are hearing for the first time, even though you have heard it before, understanding it differently now, the words rearranged by context into something heavier than they were. I said nothing. He walked out of the kitchen. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, the footsteps of a man carrying something he had not yet put down. And then the sound of the guest room door, and then the house was quiet. I sat at the kitchen table in the November light with my coffee and my laptop and my phone face up for the first time in as long as I could remember. 3 unread messages, 2 missed calls, a cover story in November. I thought about my mother's radiator jar, about the spiral-bound ledger with the blue cover, about the $12 set aside every month for when the noise got too loud. The noise I thought was finally done. I opened Diane's email and began to type. The filing happened on a Wednesday. Patricia had told me it would feel anticlimactic. And she was right. It was a document, a signature, a date stamp, the legal system. Processing the end of a marriage, the same way it processed property transfers and business registrations, with bureaucratic neutrality and a filing fee of $213. I signed where Patricia indicated, initialed 3 places, handed the pen back across the conference table in her midtown office, and looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, and thought, that's it then. Patricia walked me to the elevator afterward. In the lobby, she said, "It's going to get louder before it gets quieter. Prepare for that." She was right about that, too. The first thing that happened was Marcus's attorney called Patricia on Thursday morning with a position that suggested Marcus had not yet fully absorbed the information presented to him at the dinner table 11 days prior. The position involved the joint account and a claim of commingling that Patricia had been expecting and had already neutralized. The call lasted 19 minutes. Patricia called me afterward and said, "His attorney knows it's thin. He's going through the motions." A pause. "This will resolve quickly. Will resolve." The second thing that happened was the Forbes article. David Okafor's team had been thorough 2 days of photography at my Sandy Springs office and at a small business in Vine City that had received funding from the community development arm. A fact-checking call that lasted 3 hours, a writer named Simone, who asked questions with the precision of someone who had done her research and was now looking for the places where the research fell short. The piece ran online the 3rd week of November, 10 days before the print issue, and by the time the print cover appeared, "The Invisible Architect," in clean white type, over a photograph of me standing at the window of my office in the dark green wrap dress, looking not at the camera, but at the Atlanta skyline beyond the glass. The online version had already been shared 47,000 times. I did not track this obsessively. My assistant Renata tracked it and gave me a summary each morning with my coffee, which I read the way I read quarterly reports for signal not sentiment. The signal was significant. By the end of the first week after publication, Renata had logged 214 interview requests, 61 speaking inquiries, and one offer from a New York publisher for a book about the LLC architecture and the community investment model that was so specific in its scope that I understood immediately the editor had read the article 3 times before making the call. I asked Renata to hold everything except Diane Holloway's partnership inquiry and a call request from a woman in Houston named Dr. Vivian Cole, who ran a foundation I had been watching for 2 years and had always intended to contact when the timing was right. The timing, it turned out, had arrived on its own schedule, regardless of my intentions. The third thing that happened was Marcus. Not to me directly, we were communicating through attorneys. By then, the language of the marriage reduced to formal correspondence and document exchanges, which felt both cold and necessary, the clinical distance of a process that required precision more than feeling. What happened to Marcus happened in the world he had built around himself, the world of reputation and impression, and the careful management of how other people understood him. Robert called me on the Monday after the article dropped. He did not call to congratulate me. He had done that already briefly the previous week. He called because he was a businessman, and he had information he thought I should have. "There's a development in Cobb County," he said. "Marcus has been trying to close a commercial partner on it for 6 months. 2 investors pulled out this morning." I was quiet. "One of them told me directly," Robert said. He said, and I'm quoting, "A man who doesn't know what his wife has built in 9 years of marriage is a man who isn't paying attention. I don't partner with men who aren't paying attention." I thought about that for a long time after the call ended. I had not intended this outcome, had not engineered it, had not made calls or sent messages or done anything to move the architecture of Marcus's professional world. The Forbes article had been about me, my work, my structure, my choices. The consequences in his world had followed their own logic, the logic of professional communities, where trust is currency and credibility is assessed not just by what you know, but by what you should have known. A man who had spent 9 years telling people his wife had nothing, who had told their pastors she had a hobby, and told his oldest friend there was nothing of substance on her side. That man, it turned out, had a credibility problem that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with him. Diane Holloway called me on a Tuesday morning before 9 as promised. We spoke for 40 minutes about the Community Development Fund and a partnership structure that would connect my investment model with her nonprofit's existing community relationships in 4 Atlanta neighborhoods. By the end of the call, we had agreed on a framework and a follow-up meeting the following week with both our attorneys present. Before she hung up, she said, "I want to say something, and I hope you'll receive it in the spirit it's intended." "Go ahead," I said. "I've known Marcus for 7 years," she said. "I've sat at his table, and I've heard what he said about you. And I want to be honest, I am ashamed that I didn't ask better questions. About you specifically. About what you were building." Asterisk, a brief pause. "I should have known. I should have looked." "You know now," I said. "Yes," she said. "And I intend to make that count for something." Pastor Reeves called the following Sunday, not on my cell, but on the house line, which almost nobody used anymore, which told me he had looked it up deliberately, which told me he considered the call formal. He said he was calling to check on me, which was true, and also to tell me that he had recommended my Community Development Fund in his sermon that morning as an example of what he called quiet faithfulness, building something real in the world without requiring the world to watch you do it. I thanked him. "One more thing," he said. "The woman at the dinner, Amber." I waited. "She attends our church," he said. "Began attending in September." I understood why he was telling me. not as gossip, not as weaponized information, but as pastoral care, making sure I had the full picture of what had been happening in the geography of my own life. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I don't know what her situation is," he said. "I don't make assumptions, but I pray for everyone in my congregation." A pause. "Including you, even though you haven't been." "I'll come back," I said, and meant it. The week the print issue hit newsstands, Gerald called with the Q4 preliminary numbers. The upward movement David Okafor had noted in our Forbes conversation had continued. 2 new portfolio acquisitions closed in October. A return on the Decatur tech startup that exceeded projections by 11%, and an inquiry from a private equity group in New York that had read the article and wanted to discuss a co-investment structure on a project in Atlanta's West Side. Gerald read me the numbers in his clean accountant's voice and then said, "Stella, do you understand what this quarter looks like?" "Tell me," I said. He told me. I was standing in my office in Sandy Springs with the Atlanta skyline in the window behind me. The same view that was on the Forbes cover, the same window, the same city. And I listened to Gerald read the numbers, and I thought about the 2-bedroom apartment on the west side with the kitchen window that faced a brick wall. I thought about the jar taped to the back of the radiator. I thought about the blue ledger and the $12 a month. And my mother's voice on the phone at 6 in the morning. "How do you feel?" "Tired," I had said, and clear. I was less tired now. That afternoon, I transferred $200,000 to the Community Development Fund's next disbursement cycle, a larger allocation than the previous cycle, enough to fund 12 small business grants instead of 8. I asked Renata to update the application portal with the new cycle dates and to send a note to Pastor Reeves's office with the information for his congregation. Then I put on my coat and drove to the west side of Atlanta. I parked in front of the building where I had grown up, the 2-bedroom apartment, the brick wall outside the kitchen window, the radiator in the hallway that my mother had kept her jar behind for 22 years. The building had been repainted since I was a child, a warm terracotta now instead of the original gray. And there were plants in 2 of the ground floor windows, which there hadn't been when I was small. I sat in the car for a few minutes. Not long, just long enough to look at it. Then I drove to my mother's house in Decatur, let myself in with my key, and found her in the kitchen making the short rib recipe, the same one I had made for the dinner party, the one that had come from her mother's mother. And she looked up when I came in and said, "I figured you'd come today." "How'd you know?" I said. She pointed at the stool on the far side of the island, the one I had sat on since I was old enough to reach the counter. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me about the numbers." So I sat down, and I told her. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in January, which is not a significant day in any calendar, but which I have since come to think of as the first day of a particular kind of year, the kind that arrives not with noise, but with the quiet certainty of a door that has been closed correctly, fully, the latch catching the way it is supposed to catch. Patricia called me at 10:47 in the morning. "It's done," she said. "Everything resolved as projected. No contested assets. The joint account settlement was nominal. Your LLC structure held completely." "Thank you, Patricia," I said. "Stella." Her voice shifted into the register she used when she was not being an attorney. "It has been my genuine honor." I was at my office in Sandy Springs when the call came. After I hung up, I sat for a moment at my desk and looked at the Atlanta skyline in the window, the same view, always the same view, the city unchanged and changing simultaneously the way cities do. Then I picked up my coat and my bag and told Renata I was taking the afternoon. I drove to the west side. Parked in front of my mother's building, the terracotta paint, the plants in the ground floor windows, and then kept driving through the neighborhoods I had grown up adjacent to, past the bus stop where the 614 ran late every Thursday, past the dental office where my mother had worked the front desk for 22 years, past the small park where I'd eaten lunch alone on the first day of 6th grade because I had not yet understood the architecture of a new school's social geography, and had sat on a bench with a sandwich and a book and decided that was fine. It was fine. I drove until I found myself on Peyton Road, not intentionally or not consciously the way you sometimes arrive. Somewhere before you have decided to go there, and I sat at a red light and looked at the street and thought about the folded piece of paper I had found in my center console with this address on it. What it had meant, what it had cost, what it had, in its own terrible way, clarified. Then the light changed, and I drove on. I signed the final papers at Patricia's office that afternoon. A different set of papers than the filing. These the completion documents, the formal conclusion of a legal arrangement that had begun 14 months after I met a man at a fundraiser in Midtown who asked questions and listened to the answers. I signed where indicated, initialed 3 places, handed the pen back. On my left hand, no ring. I had taken it off the morning after the dinner party and placed it in the small ceramic dish on my dresser where I kept spare change and hair ties and the occasional lost earring back. It was still there. I had not decided yet what to do with it, and I had stopped requiring myself to decide. Patricia walked me to the elevator. In the lobby, she said, "What's next?" I thought about Diane Holloway's partnership, which had formalized in December into a structure that would put community investment capital into 6 Atlanta neighborhoods over the next 3 years. I thought about Dr. Vivian Cole in Houston and the conversation we had been having for 2 months about a co-investment framework for women-owned businesses in the South. I thought about the New York publisher's book offer, which I had declined, in favor of something smaller and more precise. A series of workshops, 6 cities, women building financial structures, quietly the mechanics of the invisible architecture made visible for the people who needed to see it. I thought about Gerald's Q4 numbers, about the 12 small business grants in the current disbursement cycle, about the application portal Renata had updated, which had received 231 submissions in the first 2 weeks. The same thing, I said, just more of it. Patricia smiled a real smile, not a professional one. "Good," she said. I drove home, not to the house on the street with the oak tree. Marcus and I had agreed he would remain there through February while his attorney finalized the property arrangements. And I had moved to a furnished apartment in Inman Park that I had rented the week after the dinner party, a clean 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor with good light and a kitchen window that faced not a brick wall, but a narrow street lined with oak trees that in January were bare and precise against the winter sky. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop. There was an email from Renata with the morning summary interviews, speaking requests, the usual volume of correspondence that had not decreased since the Forbes piece. How sorry, and that I was slowly learning to navigate without letting it become the thing that replaced the actual work. There was a note from David Okafor saying, the November issue had been one of their highest performing in 3 years, and asking if I would consider a follow-up piece in the spring. There was a message from a woman in Birmingham who had read the article and written 3 paragraphs about her own LLC structure and what it had cost her to build it, and what it had cost her not to talk about it, ending with, "I just wanted you to know someone saw it." I read that one twice. Then I called my mother. She answered on the 2nd ring. I told her it was done. She was quiet for a moment, the good quiet, the one that means she is holding something rather than waiting to speak. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I looked at the kitchen window. The oak trees on the narrow street bare and clean against the January sky. The good light coming through. The city outside Atlanta in winter, the place I had grown up in, and built in, and lost things in, and found things in the place that had been the geography of all of it. The radiator jar, and the blue ledger, and the dinner party, and the Forbes cover, and the 231 applications in the portal, and the $12 a month that had become over time something no one had expected. "Whole," I said. My mother made the sound that was not quite a laugh. That's the right word, she said. We talked for 40 minutes. About the partnership with Diane, about the Houston trip I was planning for February to meet Dr. Cole in person. About the workshops, she had opinions about the workshop curriculum. Strong ones delivered in the precise and unornamented language of a woman who had kept a ledger for 30 years and understood that the most important financial education was not sophisticated, but it was rare. I took notes on my phone while she talked. When we hung up, I made a second cup of coffee and sat at the table and opened a new document on my laptop. At the top, I typed, "What the Quiet Fund is for." I stared at it for a moment. Then I started writing, not for the publisher, not for Forbes, not for the workshops, just for myself. Just to have somewhere to put it, the whole shape of the thing, the 2-bedroom apartment and the brick wall and the radiator and the blue ledger and the $12 a month. And the 17 clients and the binder clip on the cracked laptop hinge and the fundraiser in Midtown and the 9 years and the second phone in the center console and the dinner table and the candles going out, and Patricia's elevator and the January light in a kitchen window that faced oak trees instead of a brick wall. I wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When I finished, I closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment, the particular quiet of a space that is yours alone, that holds only what you have chosen to put in it, that carries no one else's weight. Then I put on my coat and went outside. Atlanta in January is cold and flat and pale. The light low and diffused the trees, stripped to their essential shapes. I walked for an hour through Inman Park, past the Victorian houses and the coffee shops, and the small park where 2 children were feeding bread to pigeons with a serious concentration of children engaged in important work. I walked without destination, without agenda, the way you walk when you're not going somewhere, but simply moving through the world to feel it under your feet. At the end of the hour, I sat on a bench in the park and watched the pigeons and the children and the pale January sky, and thought about what my mother had said the night before the dinner party. You don't have to say a word. Sometimes you just have to be in the room when the room figures it out. I had been in the room. The room had figured it out. What I understood now, sitting on a bench in January, in a city I had built something in quietly and for a long time, was that the silence had never been the sacrifice. The silence had been the structure, the invisible architecture, the thing that looked like nothing from the outside and held everything from within. My mother had called it a quiet fund. Forbes had called it quiet capital. I called it mine, and that in the end was the only number that had ever mattered. The quietest rooms hold the loudest numbers. Build in silence. Let the work speak in its own time. And never mistake a person's stillness for absence. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is the thing no one thought to look for.